The ocean stretched like an endless mirror of steel beneath the rising sun, calm yet hiding secrets that could kill without warning. A Japanese submarine sliced silently through the dark Pacific currents, its hull groaning under pressure, its crew tense and half-starved after weeks of silent running. In the dim red light of the control room, sweat traced lines through the grime on sailors' faces as they scanned their dials. The captain, a gaunt veteran of the early victories of 1941, peered through the periscope and saw nothing but the eternal swell of the sea. Yet something was wrong. Beneath the ordinary rhythm of sonar pings, the familiar metallic heartbeat of the deep, there pulsed a new sound, sharper, colder, rhythmic but unpredictable. "Buoy contact?" whispered the sonar officer. No one answered. The Pacific had always belonged to them, or so they believed. But that day, when the crew intercepted the strange U.S. sonar buoys scattered across the ocean like invisible mines, they began to understand that control of the sea had shifted. The silence of the deep was no longer theirs to command. The hunter was now the hunted. As hours passed, tension built like pressure inside the submarine's steel shell. The strange signal patterns repeated, moving as if alive. The captain ordered depth changes and course alterations, yet no matter how far they turned, the pings followed. The sonar chief adjusted dials with trembling hands, recording every echo onto wax discs. "It's not active sonar," he muttered. "It's something else, an acoustic net." The phrase meant little to the men, but to the captain, it sounded like a death sentence. Somewhere above, unseen aircraft and destroyers listened through these floating sensors, triangulating every movement below. The Japanese Navy, once master of stealth, was suddenly navigating a battlefield that spoke back. Every decision became agony. To surface risked death by radar-guided aircraft. To stay submerged meant suffocation and madness. The suspense of the hunt, once their pride, turned into terror. The captain knew the Americans had advanced technology, but this was beyond what any manual or rumor had prepared them for. The sea itself seemed wired, alive, whispering their position to an enemy they could not touch. Hours blurred into days. Supplies dwindled. The crew grew silent, communicating only in gestures. The faint pinging of buoys echoed through the hull like mocking laughter. Every man aboard imagined the enemy destroyers overhead, silent, waiting. "They know we're here," one whispered. The captain refused to answer. He stared at the navigation chart pinned to the bulkhead, its pencil lines now meaningless. Once, Japanese subs had prowled these waters with impunity, striking convoys, surfacing to photograph burning wrecks. Now every movement risked exposure. The sonar buoys, small, drifting instruments, had transformed the vast Pacific into a cage. Even when the submarine escaped one zone, another pattern of pings began, as if the Americans had mapped the ocean into invisible corridors of detection. The suspense grew unbearable. At night, when the engines idled and the men drifted in uneasy sleep, the captain stood alone by the periscope, gazing into a blackness he no longer trusted. The ocean that had once felt infinite now felt claustrophobic, like a room closing in. The breaking point came just before dawn. A sudden sequence of rapid pings thundered through the hull, louder and closer than ever. Men leapt to their stations. Claxons wailed. The sonar officer shouted, "Multiple contacts, bearing north, closing fast." The captain ordered silent running, cutting the engines. The submarine drifted in darkness, every man holding his breath as the sound intensified. Depth charges erupted in the distance, dull booms rolling through the water like thunder from another world. The crew clenched their fists, praying the next explosion wouldn't find them. In that frozen moment, the captain realized the truth he could not say aloud. The Americans didn't need to see them anymore. The buoys, the aircraft, the destroyers, all were connected by an invisible network of sound. The ocean had become a battlefield of information, not brute force. When the explosions finally ceased and silence returned, the men exhaled shakily, but no one felt relief. The hook of fear had sunk too deep. From that moment, the Japanese submarine fleet knew the Pacific had turned against them. The steel shell of the submarine trembled with every creak, every echo that passed through the water. In the aftermath of the distant depth charge attack, the men sat in silence, listening. Nothing moved but the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling. The sonar officer, eyes red from sleeplessness, adjusted his headphones and froze. A faint mechanical hum, steady, high-pitched, was weaving through the water like a ghost. "Another buoy," he murmured. The captain's jaw tightened. "Record it." then plot a new course. They would dive deeper, slip beneath the layer of warm water that bent sound, and move east. Yet as the submarine descended, the hum followed, faint but insistent. It was as if the very sea had learned to speak English, and it was whispering coordinates to someone above. The suspense that had begun as fear now hardened into dread. The men knew they were being watched by something unseen, something scientific and relentless. When dawn broke far above them, the captain surfaced only long enough to recharge batteries. Through the periscope, he saw nothing but fog and scattered wreckage, floats, cables, the remains of a buoy torn loose by storms. He ordered a retrieval. 2 sailors climbed onto the deck, waves breaking over their boots, and hauled the device aboard. It was smaller than they expected, metallic, its fins battered but intact. The markings were American. When the engineers pried it open, the interior revealed a maze of coils, vacuum tubes, and a hydrophone disc unlike anything they had seen. "It listens," whispered the sonar chief, almost in awe. "It listens for us." The captain realized the grim implication. Every submarine that had crossed these waters in the last month had been tracked by these floating ears. They were not mines, not weapons, but they were deadlier than either. In the claustrophobic silence of the control room, the crew stared at the dismantled buoy as though it were a captured spy. The ocean had become intelligent, and it reported to Washington. Word of the discovery spread through the Japanese fleet like wildfire, carried by encrypted radio bursts and whispered in mess halls. Commanders who once mocked American technology now studied the fragments with unease. The U.S. Navy, they realized, had woven a vast net across the Pacific, an acoustic web of sonar buoys dropped by patrol planes, connected by code and frequency, relaying data back to destroyers and escort carriers. It was an invisible empire stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines. Japanese submarines, once predators, were now ghosts hunted through mathematics. The change was psychological as much as tactical. Crews who had once taken pride in silence now feared it. Every quiet stretch of sea felt like a trap. Every unexplained sound made hands tighten on valve wheels. The captain of our submarine wrote a single line in his logbook that night. "The sea has ears." The next encounter confirmed his worst fears. 3 nights later, while running at periscope depth near the Marianas, the sonar operator detected a faint ping that shifted in frequency, a human-controlled search pattern. Moments later, another ping answered from the west. 2 destroyers. The captain ordered an emergency dive, the hull groaning as pressure mounted. Depth charges followed, closer this time, shaking the lights from their mounts. One explosion cracked a ballast tank. Another ruptured a pipe, flooding the forward compartment. Men scrambled to seal hatches while the captain calculated whether to rise or descend. Rising meant detection. Descending risked collapse. He chose depth. The submarine slipped below 300 feet, deeper than safe limits, the hull vibrating like a drum. Then, just as suddenly, the attack stopped. The sonar pings faded. The Americans had moved on, but everyone aboard knew why. They hadn't lost contact. They simply knew the sub was crippled and would surface eventually. The ocean itself was marking their position for later destruction. When the crew finally rose under cover of darkness, the captain looked at the black water stretching to infinity and whispered, "This sea does not forgive." The damage control team worked in red emergency light, sealing leaks with wooden wedges and prayer. The air was sour with oil and sweat. Every hiss of escaping steam sounded like a whisper from the sea itself. They knew they'd survived the depth charges, but something worse had happened. They'd been taught fear. For years, the Imperial Navy had drilled into its men that silence and courage were enough, that the ocean was their ally if only they respected its vastness. Now, the captain realized, silence was meaningless when the enemy could hear through the water itself. He ran a hand along the cracked gauge glass and felt how the hull trembled, as if it too was listening for pursuit. The men spoke in murmurs, voices hoarse, their faith in technology and tradition bleeding away with the leaking air. The captain issued a quiet order. "Surface only when absolutely necessary. Trust nothing you hear. The Americans have turned the sea into a machine." Above them, the Pacific swelled and rolled as American patrol planes circled, their engines distant thunder. Each aircraft dropped more buoys, delicate machines drifting with the current, their antennas bobbing like seaweed. Somewhere, a radio man aboard a destroyer watched a flickering scope and smiled. Faint echoes rippled across the screen, proof that another submarine's life hung by a thread. The red and white flags painted on the sub's hull meant nothing to the technology now charting its heartbeat. For the first time, the Americans weren't hunting by luck or instinct. They were hunting by algorithm, by design. And for the first time, the Japanese realized the war had entered an age where bravery meant less than circuitry. Days later, when the sub reached a remote lagoon to refuel from a supply tender, the captain reported his findings. Officers gathered around the captured buoy laid out on the pier. Engineers dismantled it piece by piece, tracing wires and tubes. One scientist, squinting through cracked glasses, muttered that the Americans must have entire factories dedicated to producing such devices, tens of thousands, perhaps. The sheer industrial scale was mind-numbing. "We build ships," he said. "They build systems." The difference chilled everyone listening. They understood now that the Americans had made the ocean itself part of their weaponry, linking ships, aircraft, and machines into a single thinking organism. It was logistics made manifest in sound waves. The captain recorded a new line in his log. "We cannot hide from an enemy who hears through steel and salt." That night, as the crew refueled and repaired, the radio operator caught an intercepted broadcast, American propaganda transmitted in Japanese. It spoke not of conquest, but of inevitability, of science and industry rolling forward like a tide no empire could resist. The words echoed through the submarine's narrow corridors, long after the signal faded. Men lay awake, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the hull, and realized that every movement, every vibration could be traced. In the flicker of a single red light, the captain sat with his logbook open, staring at the horizon. He could feel the unseen buoys out there, patient, drifting, waiting. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we run north. The Americans think they own the ocean. Let us see if they are right." The next morning, as the submarine slipped beneath the waves once more, the sun rose over a sea that no longer belonged to them. The Pacific, once a domain of silent hunters and unseen killers, had become a web of invisible eyes. From the highest command posts in Tokyo, intelligence reports arrived like harbingers of doom. Every intercepted buoy, every broken radio transmission painted a grim picture. The Americans had constructed a system that tracked submarines, convoys, and patrols with terrifying precision. The admirals stared at their maps, red lines marking buoy locations and areas of dense coverage. Their confidence, once absolute, now wavered. The ocean they had ruled for years was no longer theirs. Orders were sent immediately. Submarines must alter courses, travel only at night, and adopt new silent running protocols. But even these measures felt like band-aids against a predator that could see in the dark. The suspense thickened across the command floor, officers exchanging grim looks, aware that each delay, each interception, could cost lives in hours. The war had changed and the hunters had become the hunted. Meanwhile, deep beneath the waves, crews of Japanese submarines struggled with the psychological weight of the new reality. The sonar officer tapped his console obsessively, trying to distinguish natural underwater echoes from the rhythmic pings of American buoys. Every blip became a potential death sentence. Engines ran at minimum to reduce noise. Oxygen levels dropped as men held their breath longer between dives, and every shadow on the sonar scope was treated as a possible hunter-killer group. The fear was cumulative. Hours stretched into days, and morale waned. Officers who once prided themselves on instinct and courage now relied entirely on calculation and guesswork. Even the simplest navigation exercise had become a gamble. Above all, the men understood one terrifying fact. The Americans didn't need to engage them directly. Surveillance alone, the invisible network of buoys and listening devices, could isolate, track, and destroy them at the right moment. As the submarine fleet attempted to adapt, reports of encounters filtered back from the front lines. Submarines attempting to reach supply routes were harassed, sometimes destroyed, by destroyers guided by buoy data. Aircraft dropped sonar-equipped depth charges with lethal accuracy. The Americans didn't need to search. The water itself had become the enemy's informant. Engineers in Tokyo tried to analyze the devices, but many lacked the resources or understanding to replicate the technology. Panic rippled subtly through the hierarchy. Fleet commanders ordered extreme secrecy, fearing that even whispers of American capabilities would demoralize crews. In hushed conversations in mess halls, sailors speculated about the scale of the American industrial effort, realizing that the sonar network was only one layer of a far greater system. The entire Pacific was being mapped and monitored continuously. In one isolated engagement, a Japanese sub attempted a daring run through a known buoy field to reach an isolated convoy. The crew worked in near-perfect synchronization, engines barely humming as they descended to avoid detection. Yet, hours later, they realized that a pattern of depth charges was waiting exactly where calculations predicted their path would be. They had been anticipated. The buoy network had relayed their every move to surface ships and aircraft, creating a kill zone in a stretch of ocean hundreds of miles long. The suspense was palpable. Every sound, every vibration was scrutinized as a possible harbinger of death. Men whispered prayers, instruments clattered under trembling hands, and the captain's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. We move like shadows, but the shadows are now listening. It was a chilling realization. No matter how skilled, no matter how careful, they were navigating in a theater controlled not by nature, but by human ingenuity and relentless technology. As the submarine crept through the darkened waters, every officer on deck felt the weight of the unseen surveillance pressing down like an invisible hand. The captain's face, lit only by the faint glow of the instrument panel, was drawn and pale. He studied sonar readings, trying to distinguish the natural murmurs of the ocean from the deadly hum of U.S. devices. Every small blip on the scope was treated as a potential threat. Every wave against the hull a signal that death could be moments away. The men held their positions with tense silence, each breath measured, each movement calculated to reduce acoustic signatures. Outside, the ocean was deceptively calm, but within the steel confines of the sub, tension roiled like a storm. The suspense was palpable. One miscalculation, one overlooked signal, and the vast Pacific could become a grave. Japanese command in Tokyo was in a state of frantic analysis. Buoy locations, sonar frequencies, and known convoy paths were compiled into charts, maps, and diagrams that filled entire rooms. Commanders debated potential countermeasures, from rerouting supply lines to changing attack tactics, yet every plan was undermined by the Americans' superior ability to detect and anticipate movements. Engineers theorized about neutralizing the buoys, attempting to jam frequencies or deploy decoy signals, but resources were limited and time was short. The realization spread like wildfire. No matter how clever or stealthy the submariners were, the Americans had turned the Pacific itself into a weaponized intelligence network. Every sub running its missions now faced a silent adversary, and the notion of freedom under the waves was a memory fading into myth. Back aboard the submarine, the psychological strain was evident. Crew members grew restless, the air heavy with fear and tension. Officers took shifts at the sonar consoles, scanning, recording, and recalculating patterns. Even routine tasks, like checking ballast tanks or inspecting torpedoes, became exercises in extreme caution. One young sailor accidentally dropped a wrench, the metallic clatter echoing through the hull. Silence fell instantly, as though the crew collectively held its breath, fearing that somewhere above a hidden listener had registered the sound. The captain reassured them only with a calm voice, but inside he too knew the truth. The war beneath the waves had changed forever. There were no safe havens, no silent corridors of the deep. Only constant vigilance and calculated movement could stave off detection. A pivotal encounter crystallized their fear. The submarine attempted a nighttime approach toward a critical convoy, threading a course through multiple known buoy fields. Hours into the run, a series of rapid pings echoed through the hull, triangulated perfectly from multiple sources. Surface destroyers suddenly appeared, alerted by the invisible web of sonar buoys, and began a coordinated depth charge attack. The sub shook violently, alarms blaring as water rushed into damaged compartments. The crew worked in near-perfect coordination to manage flooding, maintain course, and minimize acoustic signatures, but the attacks persisted. Each explosion underscored a harsh reality. The Americans didn't need to find them. They already knew where they were. By the time the submarine escaped, battered and exhausted, the men were no longer hunters. They had become hunted, navigating a vast ocean whose silence had been stolen. Japanese engineers and strategists worked feverishly to devise countermeasures. On one level, they attempted the predictable, rerouting submarine paths, establishing new silent-running procedures, and creating decoy floats designed to mimic subsignatures. Yet each plan felt inadequate. They lacked the raw industrial capacity and technological infrastructure of the Americans. The U.S. had already produced tens of thousands of sonar buoys, enough to blanket key ocean sectors, and every surface ship and aircraft acted as a node in a vast, listening network. Every attempt at deception was met with rapid, often fatal adaptation. The sea itself had become a weaponized system, its natural acoustics harnessed by human ingenuity. Japanese command documents began to read like chronicles of defeat in advance, notes on failed ambushes, missed supply convoys, and submarines damaged or lost to unseen tracking devices. The suspense was more than tactical, it became existential. In the submarine hulls, fear transformed into a creeping obsession. Officers monitored every ping, every faint echo, analyzing patterns late into the night under the oppressive red glow of instrument lights. The men spoke less. Even whispered conversations risked vibration through the metal hull. One young sailor, pressed against the bulkhead, felt the rhythmic tapping of the sonar console reverberate into his chest, as though the ocean itself were beating. Rumors spread of entire crews lost to detection before they could fire a single torpedo. The psychological burden was immense. The men could no longer rely on instinct or skill alone. Their enemy was everywhere and nowhere, listening in silence, making the vast Pacific feel impossibly small. The tension built layer upon layer, like the depth charges detonating above, leaving every soul aboard in perpetual suspense. On the surface, Japanese command experimented with more audacious ideas: nighttime patrols under dense cloud cover, magnetically shielded hulls, and attempts to capture or destroy buoys before they could relay data. Yet every effort carried enormous risk. Submarines sent to disable buoy networks often returned battered, sometimes not at all. The Americans anticipated these moves, using aerial reconnaissance and pre-positioned destroyers to intercept the attackers. For the crews, every mission became a high-stakes gamble: run the gauntlet, survive the silent surveillance, and hope to strike before being eliminated. The Pacific was no longer neutral water. It was a controlled battlefield where even the ocean's natural camouflage had been turned against them. Each encounter reinforced the growing dread. That strategy and courage might be irrelevant against a machine that heard all. A harrowing escape underlined the merciless reality. One sub, tasked with approaching a convoy to lay mines, had carefully plotted a zigzag course to avoid known buoy zones. For hours it slipped beneath the surface, engines off, every man barely breathing. Suddenly, a rapid sequence of pings alerted the captain. Surface ships emerged from the night mist, dropping depth charges along the projected path with mechanical precision. The hull shuddered violently as each explosion tore through the surrounding water. Water seeped through the forward compartments. Alarms screamed. The crew executed emergency maneuvers with practiced calm, diving to near-crush depth, holding their breath, and trusting fragile steel to keep them alive. Hours later, battered but unbroken, the sub surfaced far from the convoy. The men understood with a mix of relief and horror that their escape had been granted not by luck, but by careful calculation of the Americans' limitations. The Pacific had become a labyrinth where every turn could lead to destruction, and the maze itself was alive, listening, and patient. Days turned into a haunting pattern of routine terror. Submarines slid silently beneath the waves, each officer attuned to the faintest mechanical whisper, each sailor's heartbeat echoing in time with the sonar pings that marked them for death. Morale eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as missions that once inspired pride now delivered only dread. Crews began to speak less, their conversations clipped and cautious, fearing not only the enemy but the consequences of revealing knowledge too openly. The captain kept meticulous logs of every contact, every anomaly, every almost encounter, knowing that a single miscalculation could end lives. In this new era, bravery alone was insufficient. Survival demanded total mastery over sound, movement, and the unseen intelligence lurking in the Pacific. The suspense hung like a thick fog in the control room, each sonar echo a potential herald of doom. Commanders in Tokyo studied reports with a growing sense of helplessness. Every analysis of buoy patterns, of lost submarines, revealed that the Americans were not merely reactive but anticipatory. Algorithms, human ingenuity, and industrial might combined to form an invisible net spanning thousands of miles of ocean. Engineers theorized frantic countermeasures, but many plans failed before they could be implemented. Even successful missions came at a terrible cost: submarines damaged, supply lines disrupted, crews psychologically frayed. The industrial and technological gap, once a whisper in the back of the minds of the admirals, had now become a screaming reality. The ocean was no longer a neutral arena. It was a theater dominated by an enemy who had turned nature itself into a weapon. Inside the submarine, tension coiled tighter with every hour. Crew members began to interpret ordinary sounds as ominous signs: the hiss of a valve, the faint groan of the hull under pressure, the distant crash of a wave against the conning tower. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, and unnervingly quiet. The captain, always calm in appearance, carried a private knowledge that weighed on him more heavily than any depth charge. The Americans did not need to hunt them with brute force. Their technology, their listening networks, their relentless industrial capacity meant that survival depended on slipping through a net that was nearly omnipresent. Hope became fragile, shadowed by the constant presence of an invisible adversary. Even when the sea appeared calm, the crew felt the eyes of the buoys, the ears of destroyers, and the patient intelligence of the Americans closing in. A final confrontation crystallized the new reality. One submarine, attempting a high-risk night approach to strike a vital supply route, found itself ensnared in a carefully mapped trap. Buoys registered every movement, triangulating their position with deadly precision. Surface ships emerged from the darkness, dropping depth charges in a choreographed sequence that left no corner of escape untouched. The hull vibrated violently as explosions tore through the surrounding waters. Instruments rattled, alarms screamed, and water began to seep into damaged compartments. Through it all, the captain maintained composure, issuing orders that balanced life against strategy, hope against reality. Hours passed with the sub navigating a gauntlet that seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, the attack ceased. The submarine survived, but the men had been transformed. They no longer saw the Pacific as a domain of opportunity. It was now a theater of calculation, of stealth, and above all, of dread. Their enemy had turned the sea itself into a predator, patient, relentless, and inescapable. In the quiet aftermath of each encounter, Japanese crews were left to wrestle with a bitter truth. The ocean that had once offered cover and opportunity now felt like a calculated adversary. Every current and swell a potential signal to unseen enemies. Captains and officers wrote detailed logs, not just of tactical maneuvers, but of the mental strain on their men. Sleep became erratic. Dreams were invaded by sonar pings and phantom depth charges. The line between reality and fear blurred. Crews spoke in whispers, measured movements, and hushed voices shaping every action. The silence of the deep, once a protective shroud, had been stripped away. The suspense, that tight coil of tension that had first gripped them on their initial encounters, now lingered permanently, a reminder that the Pacific had become an instrument of surveillance and control. Commanders in Tokyo struggled to reconcile the new reality with decades of naval doctrine. Entire strategy sessions revolved around countering invisible systems they barely understood. Plans to disrupt or destroy buoy networks were constrained by limited resources, and each failed attempt highlighted the gap in industrial and technological capacity. The American system was resilient, vast, and anticipatory. It did not merely react, it predicted. For fleet commanders, this meant that traditional tactics, audacity, or even bravery could not guarantee success. They had to rethink the very nature of naval warfare. The ocean itself had become a weaponized environment, and every decision carried amplified consequences. The psychological weight of this understanding pressed down on them, shaping orders that were cautious, conservative, and defensive. Actions dictated less by opportunity than by survival. Aboard each submarine, the cumulative stress manifested in quiet desperation. Men moved like ghosts through narrow corridors, constantly listening, recalculating, measuring each breath and motion. Every ping, every mechanical hum became a harbinger of death or disaster. Some officers grew obsessive, mapping sound patterns and trying to anticipate enemy responses with near fanatical dedication. Others turned inward, lost in thought, haunted by the realization that stealth and experience were no longer sufficient. The humans had become secondary to a network of devices, of machines, of industry, and of calculation. The Pacific was no longer a vast theater of naval maneuver. It was a controlled arena where every motion was anticipated, tracked, and potentially punished. The point of no return became clear during one particularly tense mission. A submarine operating near the Marianas attempted a risky attack on a supply convoy. The crew slipped beneath the surface, engines silent, holding their collective breath. Yet the moment they entered the American-mapped zone, sonar pings registered their position instantly. Depth charges rained down with uncanny timing. The sub was battered, leaking, and teetering on collapse. Only through split-second decisions and the captain's calm command did it escape. Yet there was no triumph, only the grim understanding. The Pacific was no longer theirs to command. Even successful missions came at the cost of mental exhaustion and heightened dread. The ocean had become a sentient battlefield, and the Americans had not even fired a torpedo. The machinery of surveillance, intelligence, and anticipation had done its work.